Moving on, the last thing I'll sort of talk about here is just kind of a general overview of Season of the Deep. Now my prediction was that the narrative would realign, or that this season would realign the narrative of Destiny, and I think if next season is really interesting and quite strong narratively, considering Veil Containment as well, even though that's kind of more of a Lightfall thing, I feel like this season has realigned the narrative. It's kind of brought back in Savathun. It's introduced we've had we've learned about the Witness's origins. We've learned about there's a lot of things in this season we've learned that have kind of really kind of given us a nice sort of ramp off point to kind of go into the showcase to learn more going to next season. Uh, maybe I wouldn't say some of the best they've done, but I do think it's like we've learned a lot, and I do think that even if this season hasn't been great narratively overall, the last few weeks were pretty good. And so I think generally like this season's kind of a weird one because you've got kind of like the story where it starts off like kind of slow and then kind of ends and has some cool reveals. Veil Containment was actually, like I said, some of the most interesting lore and story I think we've got. Obviously, that was more of a Lightfall thing. But then in terms of activities, you've got Salvage, which I think was a pretty underwhelming activity, and I think it's probably one of the weakest they've put out. But then you've got Deep Dives, which are really cool, and they're taking these like rogue-like elements and sort of adding them to Destiny, and I think it really gives an interesting way to play. I just recently did the tier 7 for the first time. It's kind of so I could get the Wicked Implement Catalyst, which again, that's obviously part of this, this season as well. It's like that little kind of like sudden exotic quest that suddenly showed up in Deep Dives, and even if that created problems for the activity, it was still a cool reveal. And getting the catalyst as well, which is, as we'll talk later, is getting a buff with Headstone, which is nice. I just sort of think deep dives are really cool. Honestly, very kind of you can see how that can evolve, I think, and you can see how that is like a new set of ideas, and so I think that's a really cool uh, type of activity, and I kind of hope they experiment more and do different ideas with it. And I mentioned Wicked Implement, and it's funny, I was actually doing one of my Guardian rank objectives was I think it's to do 5 Master Lost Sector solo, and I was trying to figure out best build to do it. I think it's Bay of Drowned Wishes. It's like when you spawn in on the Dreaming City, it's like the one right behind you, like in the caves, in like the rocks behind you. Um, I was doing that one, and I actually ended up using Wicked Implement for it, and I was basically using Overload on the Scout Rifle, um, like it's like the artifact perk, whilst I was also using its slowing ability, which is also an overload effect, and then you've got the shatter effect, so the unstoppables. I was kind of hitting, slowing them, and then freezing them, whilst using a stasis subclass, and then I was using Fire and Forget, which I think is the 3 burst linear fusion from Season of the Seraph, which I have uncrafted, and I don't know why I don't use that more, because I really like that weapon a lot. Again, we've spoken before about these different weapons or subfamilies and archetypes that Bungie've done. I think one of those I haven't spoken about before, but that one's one like a really cool 3 round burst linear, very cool. Um, and yeah, I was just like I was doing that, and I think what was my special? I was using Wicked Implement, and I was using Fire and Forget as my heavy, and uh, I can't remember what I was using for my special. Oh, I was using the Season of the Seraph Glaive, which I can't remember what it was. Is it Calgrath's Judgment? I think maybe. And I was using Unstoppable Glaive as well, which was kind of just like a one and done, easy. If I wasn't able to get the proper like stun off through shattering from like slowing with Wicked Implement or whatever else, or stasis grenades, because I was using stasis subclass as well. But yeah, I was doing that. I could then swap to the glaive and I could just like hit him and easy do that. I did it without dying, and then I think I must have already had that triumph because I didn't get any triumph completion. I actually forgot to check that. But yeah, that was kind of what I was trying to do without dying, and so I got those done. So that was fun. It was actually really interesting. I've struggled to not use Strand for a while, and using suddenly swapping to Stasis again. I did this a few months back, and I just tried Stasis. I was like, man, Stasis is a lot of fun. Um, and I think people are like a lot of people were saying it needs a buff as well. I think maybe that's more so in PvP. I don't know. But yeah, and obviously Wicked Influence getting a buff as well, so basically it will make what I was doing even better, and I haven't even got the catalyst upgraded yet, so I was doing it kind of without, not even a fully powered up version of the gun. But it was really cool, honestly, and it kind of like even talking about, like, I almost want to go back in, and I'm going to have to play more anyway, but I almost want to try some more, like, Legend of Master Lost Sectors, trying to figure out a build, and try and, like, see to try and like it's something I don't mess around with too often, but like trying to find a build that really kind of complements the activity you're doing, like the Lost Sector, and seeing like what kind of works best. Because at first I was using Malfeasance. I've also find I was trying to use like Overload champions. I think are really strange, honestly. That's one thing that kept showing yesterday was that I went and had a look up and I watched Dato's video on how to stun them, and I'm just like I understand how to stun them. Like I know what, so like I wasn't wrong with what I was doing, but I just find that there's something that's wrong about them where they are regenerating health sometimes where it doesn't make sense. Like the other champions like anti-barrier is easy because the only time you need to stun them is when they put up their shield, and so when they put up your shield, you damage them, and that's when they regain health. But as long as you're damaging them, they don't regain health. Unstoppables don't regain health, but they have like really high damage resistance until you stun them. But you can kind of work those out, but sometimes I find that the champion effect wears off, and this feels it doesn't feel very good, and I noticed that especially with the Overload yesterday. Like, I was literally stunning them with Overload, and I was getting about 2 or 3 second window to damage them, and I tried doing it without stun, like, without, like, because I know stasis at one point was, like, affecting them, so I tried, like, okay, let's not use stasis, let's just try and, this was still when I was using Malfeasance as well, I think. And not that I was using Malfeasance again, so I was using a Scout Rifle with Overload on to kind of proc that, and then swapping back to Malfeasance to try and... But I was basically like, I found that what I was having to do is like, I stun them with Overload, I swap to Malfeasance, fire off the 5 shots, get the explosion, and then swap back to the Scout and carry on. But typically they're getting their damage resistance back before the Overload procs, again to stun them, or before they're stunnable kind of thing. But they will actually start regenerating health if you're not shooting them, but you have to be shooting them seemingly with an overload gun to stop them. So I don't know if mine bugged out or not, but I do think that there's something strange with overload champions that just isn't quite working well, and I don't know if it's me messing something up, but I can't work out what, because I'm literally hitting them with an overload weapon, and the overload, obviously it works by, like, you keep shooting, and then one of the shots will suddenly proc overload, you hit them, and then you see the gun light up and it shoots them. Uh, and it was doing that several times, and obviously wasn't hitting them, but sometimes they were gaining their health back in that time, or not. So even if I was shooting with a scout, they generally weren't. But it was just kind of like, well, if they're not going to proc from the scout rifle, then I should probably use another weapon to damage them. But then I was doing that, and then they were getting their health back in that time, and so it was almost like I was having to kind of like keep focusing on them with the scout rifle, so because for some reason that was the only weapon keeping them from stopping regenning. And obviously that's partly because the scout rifle is the overload weapon, but more what I was trying to get at, right? So you stun them, then you swap to another weapon, you deal damage, and that's how I've always done it, and that's been fine. But it seemed like I was getting 2 or 3 seconds of damage, and that was it. Like you will see even the number would be like what consistent, it would be a bigger number, and then suddenly it would drop down, and I was barely doing any damage. But then they would start regaining their health within a second or two after that. But you seem to only be able to stun them after like nearly every 10 seconds, like 8 to 10 seconds or something, just a guess. But when I noticed if I just kept shooting with my scout rifle, obviously the gun kept proccing overload, but it wouldn't stun them, but it would stop them from regaining health. And then eventually, once the time that, once they become stunnable again, it suddenly then procs again, and then it does stun them. And so I was just finding something strange about that, and I do think that there's something underlying, something that's wrong with overload champions in particular. And I think unstoppable struggle, I think anti-barrier are the most consistent. Uh, and as I said, I don't know if I'm somehow messing something up. I don't quite know what it is, because I tried a bunch of different things, and it was honestly, I was finding it worked better yesterday when I was just laying on the enemy by chucking like a Duskfield grenade around the enemy, and then like hitting them with a stasis, like kunai or whatever, to like keep them slowed, and then hitting them in the head with the Wicked Implement, because I was basically constantly proccing slow, freeze, and thus overload from slow, and then the overload from the rounds from the gun, and it was just like, even though it was sometimes going up and down, like 1 minute it was doing more damage than the next minute, it was just an easier way to just try and keep focused on them. And yeah, I can't quite work out what was going on there, but still, Wicked Implement's a pretty cool gun. It's cool actually using a new exotic and taking it into a lost sector like that, Legend or Master Lost Sector, because I hadn't done that before. Or I've not done that, I think, ever. I don't think I've ever taken like a new exotic and gone like, oh, let's try a high difficulty content with it. Sometimes I have, like, some, like Galahorn would be one, Quicksilver Storm, I guess, but not like a new in-season exotic, I don't think. But yeah, and then on another part of the season is obviously the dungeon, Ghost of the Deep, which I think is a really awesome dungeon. I soloed the first. Did I solo the second encounter? No, I don't think I ever soloed. I don't think I soloed the second encounter. I soloed the first encounter. It's pretty simple. Um, I think the dungeon's really cool. Has some really cool aesthetics. I like where it starts. It's very grand scale. It's got a lot of cool like environments. My biggest issue is that I feel like the difficulty for solo play is really unbalanced, and I think they've got to figure out a way to make the solo experience a lot better because currently the solo experience is really not fun. It's not. It's challenging, but in a we're gonna throw tons of enemies at you. The enemies don't stop spawning, and it just feels like an utter just It's just chaotic, and that's on top of like bosses having too much health as well. So it's kind of just like a mess, really. That's what it feels like, um, and it kind of ruins it because like I've soloed a couple of the dungeons and like it's a cool challenge. Like I like soloing the dungeons, but with this time in particular, yeah, with this particular dungeon, I don't think it was a very good solo experience, and that's a shame because I think I sort of like I said I would like to solo these more, and so that was a bit of a shame. But generally, I'm also just checking on the Bungie website 'cause it's just gone 3 o'clock as well. Like I mentioned earlier, maybe something's come up, but I don't think anything has. So then we'll be free. I imagine a blog post will go out until later today anyway. So but no teasers either. There's a PlayStation tweet about Gran Turismo, but not a Destiny tweet. Uh, yeah, it doesn't seem like there's anything. But anyway, so yeah, I just sort of find the dungeon. It's a really cool dungeon. When I played with two other people, honestly, really cool. Got to experience it, got to play it. I still think the bosses have maybe a bit too much health, but at least there you with two other players, it's not as challenging. But they've scaled things based on the player count before. I don't know why they're not doing it with dungeons, and that's not to say like they should make it easier for solo players. It's like I'm not asking for it to be easy. I think it makes sense that you have it being, like I remember being Prophecy on my own, and that was a huge accomplishment years back, and not done it in a while, so maybe it's easier now. I'm sure it is, but that was one sort of dungeon that I remember doing, and I was like, wow, like that really took it out of me like last, and I wanted to do it solo flawless, but I was just like, nah, that is a commitment. That would be something to work towards, and I just never got around to it. But yeah, I just think I think the Spire of the Watcher has a similar issue. Second and third encounters are just not fun. I actually really like the second encounter. I like Spyro overall as a dungeon. And when it first came out, I soloed the first two encounters. I spent a long time on that second one, but yeah, the third encounter, like both the second encounter has the problem of just like the boss having way too much health, and it's very demanding for a solo player that feels like you can barely get any damage off, and it feels like you're having to go to like 8, 9, 10 phases, and I'm sure like if you're like super optimal, like you can bring it down to like 6 or 7, but I'm like, why does a solo player have to go through like 6 or 7 phases? Like, isn't the fact that they're doing the mechanics and killing all the enemies and doing all that on themselves, that's an accomplishment in itself? And then the final encounter just starts throwing exploding enemies at you every like fucking like 15, 20 seconds. I just think it's a little bit too much, and it's a shame because I would really like to solo those dungeons, but I don't think I want to like go crazy. And like a lot of people would just be like, oh, just run Solar Titan and just like heal yourself. But it's like, I don't want to just use what everyone's using. Like I want to figure it out myself. You know, if what I'm working isn't working, if what I'm using doesn't work, then yeah, maybe I'll look into other options. But that will be for me to explore, and I don't want to just feel like I'm cornered into like having to use this particular build just so I can have like restoration going and cure and all these buffs to keep me alive. I'm just like, that's not you can't. That's ridiculous. It's like some people have been running. I mean, it's fine. So like the thing about the second encounter in Ghost of the Deep, for example, is that you're going in like if you use like Arc Assassin's Cowl, you can kind of like that's what I was doing for a while, and I was testing that, and that worked for quite a. I got further with that because you roll, you punch with Assassin's Cowl, you go invisible, you get health back, um, and you use the roll. I think it's Gambler's Dodge. I think is it called? I believe, unless that's the other one. And you roll near an enemy and you get your melee charge back, and then you punch them, and then if you get a kill, you get health back from the arc. You also get health back from your um, Assassin's Cowl plus invisibility. And if not, you have like the combination of Jolt, and you'll be able to punch and create an explosion on enemies. And so, there's cool builds there, but I just sort of like that. That's forcing you into something, and sure, you get into this like close quarters play style, but it's sort of like what I find most frustrating is it's just constant chaos. Like it just doesn't stop. And I really feel like it's not good design, and I think it's terrible because like if you're playing with three people, it's actually pretty simple. Like obviously I've been well I did master mode, I did the boss of master, but I think um but or was that during maybe it was during the cheese actually. You know, when everyone was doing the cheese, everyone was like knocking down the boss, maybe that was it. Um but yeah, like the generally I'm like I don't it's difficult, but it's not like super like this is so overwhelming. What the hell difficulty that but when you go solo, it is, and it's a shame because I really like the dungeon up until that point, and I just really I kind of lost interest and I didn't like it really much after like really struggling with it on solo. Uh, and like I've seen people do it solo, and it looks easier than when people do it. But even when I'm watching them, I'm like, why are there so many enemies on the screen right now? This is not. Especially when all I see is just someone running around bonking enemies with a hammer, and just like it's like you can say it's easy because of that, but it's like, but is that really easy, or is that just a build that's clearly out of line with so many others? And I tried a bunch of different things. I tried Osteo Striga. I tried I think I was using Strand when I first went in there. I tried using, I think Night Stalker. I tried using a bunch of things. I did then try the Assassin's Cowl thing, and I think, as I said, I definitely got further with that. I haven't tried it with Titan, like bonk hammers and stuff, but it's like, as I said, it's like I don't want to be forced into that just so I can solo the dungeon. I don't know if anything's different now because I think was the 20% primary open damage buff was that season of the deep that came with? I'm not quite sure. I think it was. But maybe it's worth trying again now. I don't quite know. Probably better at the end of the season as well because of being a high level as well. Actually, that's something else to consider. So maybe I could sort of like go in and see what it's like, but I don't know. Doesn't strike me the same way that the old dungeons do, and I find that the old dungeons are probably outdated now in terms of like their sandbox balance, like their difficulty in relation to the sandbox right now. But Prophecy, I always felt that felt like a really tough kind of like challenge to overcome, but I don't think it was like imbalanced. I don't think it was unfair. Boss health was totally fine. Even there, you're looking at you know potentially 4 to 5 phases on like the final boss, but it's like I kind of am not too fussed about that because it's like, well, it's 4 or 5 phases. If I'm used to doing it with 3 phases, an extra phase or two isn't too bad, you know. And again, some of that's reliant on heavy ammo, some of that's reliant on there's lots of things that's reliant on, and so um, yeah, I just think that the Ghost of the Deep and Spire of the Watcher, and even Duality was the first one that came out that I was like, oh my god. And I actually, and even Grasp of Avarice I thought was fairly simple when I was doing it with a friend, or with 3 players. But you go and do it on your own, and I'm just like, why does this boss have so much health? I soloed Grasp, uh, I think before Lightfall came out. I'm not quite sure. But that I spent ages on, and again, it was just like, why do these enemies have so much health? Why is this enemy a sponge? Like, why is the Shank in the Vandal and the center platform have so much health? And it's like, and you could be like, oh, you just need to like damage stack, but it's like, but why does every build need to be about damage? Like why can it not be about other things? And it clearly can be in other content. Like I think Legend and Master Lost Sectors are balanced really well. I think Legendary Campaign is balanced really well. I think raids were balanced really well. I remember doing Vow of the Disciple. I got the first and second. Did I get the second encounter done on day one? I can't remember that, but I definitely got the first encounter done on day one when it came out on the contest mode, and I thought that balancing was just really good. You know, it felt very challenging, felt punishing, but it felt like it was rewarding to play. And I don't feel like, and I honestly I love that. I love that experience of raids. Like honestly, I think raids are some of the best content in games. Honestly, and I really like Vow of the Disciple as well. Besides the intro, the intro is really long and unnecessary, really. But yeah. But yeah, so I think that's pretty much it. I guess the only other thing here is the overall like aesthetic and style. I actually really like what they did this season. I think it was interesting having the underwater kind of gameplay, even though it's very basic. I think it's cool to see Bungie kind of going out of the, trying different gameplay styles. Where you've got underwater and you collect the bubbles, and there's no combat underwater, sure, but I still feel like it's an interesting experiment and shows that Destiny can go beyond just gunplay and shooting, and that's kind of also what fishing shows. And people, we could meme it if but like it's still cool to see that they're experimenting with different things. And even again, even fishing is like super basic as well. To be fair, but I think both of them add to giving this season and giving Destiny a little bit of a different feel. Like, oh, I'm just gonna go and catch some fish. I have a seasonal challenge I'm gonna go and do at some point that is just literally catch like 5 legendary exotic fish. And I'm actually missing one of the exotic fish as well, which again it's all RNG. It's it's just you sit there pressing square. It's pretty basic. It's very basic in fact, but still, I think it's something that they could explore and they could evolve if they wanted to over time, and it adds a different kind of element to Destiny and makes it feel more kind of like an MMO and a bit silly, a bit like why when there's this huge threat looming over us, why are we fishing for fish? It's like why, but it's like but why not? It just kind of I think those elements are things that can kind of add a nice spin to a game, and it's almost like the kind of how Kojima does it with like his games, where it's like uh, you have like a super serious plot, but then you have these like really wacky and crazy, like ridiculous side missions and side characters and things like that that just don't make really any sense and feel like they don't quite fit into the overall thing. But it just adds a bit of adds a bit of fun to the overall game, and I think that's something to be applauded for right there. And so yeah, so I think overall, Season of the Deep, it's not the game's best season. I think it's the well, I think Season of the Seraph was the best season we've gotten since Season of the Splicer. But I think this season was better than Haunted. I think it was better than Plunder, and I would say it was better than Risen. But Risen was also with Witch Queen, so I thought Risen was actually the best expansion launch season. So, I think in the last, if we were taking last year's seasons and this year's seasons, I think this is my second favorite. Honestly, I think with Plunder at the bottom, then probably like Haunted above it, then Risen, um, and then uh, what's it called? Then Deep, and then what do you call it? The other one that I said earlier, Seraph, above that one as well. Oh, and Defiance would be like fourth, like just above Plunder, but yeah, I think Defiance wasn't that great either. But yeah, it's been a cool season. Honestly, I don't think it's been terrible, and I'm really hoping. It sounds like next season's gonna be a pretty big shakeup, and so looking forward to seeing more about that next Tuesday, getting to play it and seeing it at the showcase. That'll be cool. And yeah, so that's pretty much what's been going on in Destiny. That's my kind of review for Season of the Deep, if you will. Hey, so if you liked what you heard here, be sure to check out the full Untitled Destiny podcast and extra playlists for more extensive discussions on various topics surrounding Destiny 2, including the latest news, what's happening in game, and what's yet to come. And if you're wanting to listen to my thoughts on games outside of Destiny, why not check out the What I'm Playing podcast, where I cover all the latest happenings of the industry that have piqued my interest, as well as the latest games I'm playing. For now, though, thanks for listening, and have a good one.